The path of psychedelics from international outlaw to upstanding member of society was never going to be a simple one. Yet today we find ourselves with challenges we only could have dreamed of 20 years ago. Our next panel will bring us up to speed on the current and future state of play in the regulatory space. So please welcome our next panel, Laws, Liberties and Psychedelics, the Future of Policy and Reform.
Hello. So I know everybody's settling back from the break. Our subject here is laws, liberties, and psychedelics, the future of policy and reform. And I want to start with the elder on the panel, Ethan. Yeah.
Yes.
Who I think, your decades in many ways, you definitely were a founder of the Drug Policy Alliance, but also in many ways kind of opened the field that everyone here is stepping into in many new ways. So I wonder if you want to kind of if you would think back across these decades, looking back at the US, but also globally, what major transformations in this large area, laws, liberties, and psychedelics. I mean, psychedelics kind of came into the field. That's not really where you started. But what major transformations strike you? And the outstanding transformations, and also perhaps what surprises you the most, even at what is on the table in this room this week?
Okay, well, I guess taking a sort of bird's eye view over, well, as I said yesterday, it's been almost 40 years involved in drug policy reform. And if I think back to the 1980s, there really were two major developments that kind of loomed very large in opposite directions. The first was the US war on drugs. It had actually, there was a war on, we'd had other war on drugs earlier in the 20th century, and Nixon had a war on drugs in the 70s with a global dimension. But it was really in the late 80s in response to the cocaine crisis and other things where we had really a bipartisan global war on drugs, and the US, not just domestically, incarcerating massive numbers of people, passing tough laws, but also really playing a somewhat proselytizing and even bullying role. We look at the role that Trump, for example, is playing now globally. The U.S. kind of manifested that on the drug war back in the 1980s and encouraging both bilaterally and multilaterally and through the United Nations really an oppressive, punitive, prohibitionist approach around the world that loomed very large and where governments around the world were afraid to stand up to that. The other major thing that happened in the 80s was the explosion of HIV and AIDS. And the realization within a few years it was spreading not just with homosexual sex in some parts of the world and heterosexual sex in Africa, but through the sharing of syringes. And that really pioneered the international harm reduction movement, beginning in the Netherlands and Switzerland and other parts of Europe and then Australia. And it was the notion of carving out exceptions to the prohibitionist paradigm that allowed for the emergence of needle exchange programs, the expansion of methadone maintenance, then the emergence of safe injection sites, all focused on reducing the harms of prohibitionist drug policies in the area of HIV/AIDS, and the emergence of a global harm reduction movement, which took off initially in Europe and little parts of US and Canada, and eventually became a global thing, and something which Kasia has played a really, really global leadership role for many years. I think the other major developments that one can look at, one obviously was the reform of cannabis laws and the paradoxical situation that the United States, which was the global champion of a war on drugs for almost a century, paradoxically became the global leader on cannabis reform. And I think that can be explained almost entirely by the sort of innovative medical marijuana focus that we employed beginning in the mid-1990s with state ballot initiatives and then state legislation that then became a model for many other countries in their own cannabis reform efforts. Now, I think to finish up, the two things that have most surprised me, I think one was I never would have imagined that in the United States we would land up in recent years with 100,000 people dying each year of a fatal overdose. I mean, and the whole fentanyl phenomenon. That I did not see coming. I mean, we saw it growing already 20, 25 years ago, but that it would reach that scale, that magnitude, and be that distinctively U.S. or some saying Canada, that took me by surprise. And all the harm reduction efforts in the world, prevented the problem from being even bigger. But it just became monumental, and it's something that still is frustrating in terms of what you do. The other biggest surprise was the emergence of the psychedelics renaissance. And that happening, that psychedelic renaissance where you would have that, somebody put up a slide yesterday with dozens of prominent, famous universities around the world having psychedelic research programs with this explosion of research, billions of dollars of for-profit funds, the hundreds of millions of dollars that Rick Doblin, raised in this field for philanthropic support for studies, the beginning of legislative reform through state ballot initiatives in the U.S., I would not have predicted, even when I stepped down from running Drug Policy Alliance, almost 8 years ago, I did not see that coming. So, those were really, I think, the major elements globally, as well as the surprises.
Mm-hmm. And Kasia, you're in this lineage and part of this story as well. So what became Drug Policy Alliance started as the Linda Smith Center inside Open Society, and Soros Foundation, and I believe Open Society is still, I think, the largest global funder of global drug policy and harm reduction initiatives, right? And you began as head of harm reduction initiatives and are now head of global drug policy. Is that correct? Yeah, and yesterday up here, you spoke about how important it is from your perspective that a global perspective be taken on this. So I wonder if you would just say some more about that and how you've come to that realization.
Sure. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. I'm really a believer that looking down and working on our own little spaces is important. And I don't mean little in terms of unimportant, of course, very important. But looking up and understanding how what we're doing locally needs to connect with global is important. I also know that it's boring, okay? I know that once you start thinking the UN, blah, blah, blah. So just stay with me for a second. So from Iceland, I'm actually going to Vienna. And I'm going to Vienna because the UN agency that actually has a mandate on drugs is something that's called UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Not a good combination. My preference really would be that drug-related matters sit in Geneva, where we deal with health, where there's WHO, where there's UNAIDS. Well, no, that's not where it is. Basically, all the drug-related programming at the UN, sort of coordination architecture framing sits in Vienna. And countries come together once a year for something that's called Commission on Narcotic Drugs, CND. That's what I'm going to. This is, I think, my 23rd CND. I hope. Like I'm getting stars in heaven for this. And so here's why that's significant. I mentioned yesterday that there is a process that's called that's COCA reclassification. So basically what happened is that when treaties were put into place, I think mistakenly and for totally racist reasons, we classified coca leaf. We scheduled that in Schedule 1. We basically say that coca leaf in its natural form is as dangerous as heroin, which is absurd. And so,
and when you say we, you mean the
the
international
world,
authority, the world,
right?
yeah.
The global community,
Yeah.
the world. That's the decision that we've taken. And what this means now is that even though Coca-Cola made a provision for itself that it can continue to buy coca leaf, basically the market for coca leaf is non-existent, not available, impassable. All the cocaleros that would want to sell you coca tea or maybe energy drinks are not allowed to because it's an illegal scheduled substance like heroin. And so governments of Colombia and Bolivia asked that we fix this, that we correct this historical wrong. And that process is ongoing right now. And Commission on Narcotic Drugs, CND, is going to make that decision next year. This year, WHO, who actually gathers data and makes recommendations for scheduling, is basically going through the process of review, of learning, of talking to governments, talking to civil society organizations. So actually this year is the moment that if your organizations wanted to weigh in, you can write to WHO and basically say that, A, this is absurd, B, coca has many, many excellent qualities. It's a great, it's very nutritional. It gives you a slight boost of energy. Those of you who've been to Machu Picchu and Cusco know how useful it is. So there's a process to weigh in. But people don't think about weighing in because, again, yawn, right? This is the UN, it's somewhere there, and no one really understands how to relate to it. But there's a way to engage with that process. And I think it's important that we do. Because, first of all, why should we give up all those decisions and those discussions to governments only? Obviously, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of work that people are doing, and that should be shared. I think international organizations should understand that there's a drug policy movement that is watching over this process and that has an opinion. And then thirdly, believe it or not, you can actually engage with your government who shows up in Vienna and will be voting next year. You can educate people who are oh man, I'm talking about it and I'm bored. You can engage with your government officials that show up in Vienna and basically educate them on the subject. I'm Polish, right? I grew up in Poland, and so Poland, north of Europe. When I started a conversation with our delegation, they were like, why would we even care? This is such a different part of the world. What do we want to know about coca? And so it literally is a process of sitting down with people, explaining it to them. If you're researchers, if you have titles behind your name, that much better, because they may be more interested in having that conversation with you. So again, engage in international processes because it's the right thing to do, and you actually are supporting other countries that are fighting hard to make that process work to their advantage. But also engage because when we talk about ibogaine, when we talk about plant medicines, ayahuasca, all of what happens with coca will have relevance, right, in the future. If we are successful here, if we cut pathways to communication and understanding the processes, we will be able to use them in the future. So do it because it's the right thing to do, and you are going to stand up in solidarity with other countries, but also do it for selfish purposes because we will need it as well. So that's my 3 cents on that subject. If you ever want to consider coming to Vienna, say hi. I'll explain how that works. It's important that we show up as a part of a global community.
Okay. It's not boring. Let's just get a quick read on who's in the room. Like, how many people here, raise your hand, are from Iceland? Let's see, a lot. And North America? Maybe a few of us up here. The rest of Europe? Yeah. And then the rest of the world from here. Okay. All right. Tadeusz, I'd like to go to you next. So you're the founder and executive director of Parea. Would you say a little bit about what Parea is and does? There you go.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm the founder of Parea. All right. Parea stands for Psychedelic Access and Research European Alliance. I'm also a second Pole, also from Poland, so 2 Poles on the panel. So my really kind of entry point to this work is public health and mental health. And Parea focuses on the future use of psychedelics as part of formal healthcare delivery. And I suppose what's really important for me, and you can read in the description of this panel, it mentions what are the ethical considerations related to equitable access to psychedelics, and this is really something that we pay a lot of attention to, because when you look at what equitable access means, is really that everyone, no matter what their social economic status is, no matter what is their geographic location or race and gender, everyone has timely and effective or timely and local access to healthcare interventions. I'm looking at the psychedelic field at the moment, and there are a lot of fantastic kind of offerings and retreats, high-end retreats, retreats for leaders.
Right.
But it makes me think, what about providing access to communities that are underrepresented, that are marginalized, people with financial hardship? Because guess what? These populations are the most affected by mental health conditions. And so we don't really want to create this kind of perpetuate this structural injustice and this vicious circle. They need help the most. And there is also this confluence between mental health and substance use. For instance, when you have a severe mental health condition, 2 out of 3 people with those conditions will smoke, will be smokers. Also, I just read earlier this week, WHO Euro released a report on state of health in Europe, and when they mentioned the alcohol use disorder and the kind of the coverage in terms of treatment, and it ranges from 1.2% in some countries, or the worst performing country, to almost 14%. So there is really a huge gap. And so at Parea, we think that through the medical model, we'll hopefully help these communities. And I also want to zoom out a little bit as we speak about health equity, because it just so happens that 84% of people affected by mental health conditions live in low and middle income countries. And we often see this gap of almost 10 years on average that take for a new intervention to reach these geographic regions. And not to mention that the majority of clinical trials in psychedelics happen, there's US, there's Europe, Australia, Canada, Israel, a few other places. But we should ask ourselves how the therapeutic approaches, the Western therapeutic approaches, can be appropriate, can be effective in different cultural settings. Say, India, how the trial protocols will be relevant there. So again, this is something that is important for us, and we hope, at least in Europe, that with time, once psychedelics are approved, they can be available for people at the place where they live, from given or recommended by the doctor that they trust, and paid by health insurance.
Are you a neurologist?
No, I spent my whole professional career as an advocate, a policy person in the brain space.
I'm curious if you came to brain health and mental health and then wandered into psychedelics as relevant to that, or if you came into this through this intersection between the two.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it is actually important that I come to psychedelics from my work in the space of brain health. My whole professional career was really at this nexus of brain health, multi-stakeholder alliances, and policy and advocacy work versus the EU institutions and also WHO.
Yeah, I mean, given what you just noted, and I think we all know this, I mean, you know, the US would count as a wealthier country, but our healthcare system, I think, is as inequitable as they come. Is it possible, how is it possible even to talk about a globally coordinated policy around this when you have such different healthcare models, when the issue of access is there probably universally, but the dynamics of it, the particularities are so different. Are you seeing that it's possible that global collaboration, because I know you're really passionate about global partnership and collaborations, that makes a policy effort feasible?
So I think we are still very early in the field of psychedelic therapies as kind of medicines, as part of the healthcare system delivery. So it's probably still a little too early to really think about kind of effective global layer and organization. But I like to think about kind of my work and how I want to see my outcomes in the chunks of time of 5 or even 10 years. So what can happen in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So kind of more down the road. And once these treatments are approved, I know that, you know, we will be able to learn from many other kind of therapeutic specific or disease specific efforts which have a strong international presence and strong presence, for instance, in Geneva or New York towards WHO. So I think we'll get there eventually, but not just yet.
Right. So Natalia, you are in international human rights law, and you coordinate the Ayahuasca Defense Fund at ICEERS. Would you say a little bit about ICEERS and your particular work there?
Well, I'm the coordinator of the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, which started kind of a seed program as we were looking that, you know, the legal incidents that surround plant medicines were on the rise. It's been 8 years now since it's formally was created, and contrary to what we suspected, the legal incidents have been on the rise. So it's basically the people that were supported that travel with plant medicines around the world. It's basically for ayahuasca in the first place, then psilocybin mushrooms in the second place, San Pedro in the third place, and then maybe the other plant medicines and psychedelics. Until now, we've supported 390 legal incidents in 28 countries. And of course, we've seen a rise in the coca leaf, what Kasia was bringing out here. And this is, of course, it has to do with a lot of things. First of all, there's more technology to kind of detect these substances or molecules in the airports, for example. But then, of course, we've seen how prohibitionism is kind of, you know, finding new ways of making colonialism prosper. And this is what's happening. And this has to do also with the frustration.
Yeah, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? How, make colonialism prospering? What form does that take?
It takes the masks of, for example, with science. What is considered evidence is only clinical trials.
Okay.
But we're talking about substances that have been used ancestrally for millennia. Yeah. And that is not considered scientific thinking. Sophisticated systems of knowledge that is based in the systems of relationships, of how indigenous cultures perceive health, for example.
Right.
So health is not just an indicator. It has to do with the biopsycho spiritual models of health. But that is not considered science.
And also sacred intelligence.
Exactly. That is not
considered intelligence.
It's not even considered evidence.
Yeah.
And so we need to wait until the global north accepts clinical trials as evidence. Right. But what happens is within this process, there's a colonial approach as well, because they're not even doing the clinical trials with the substance per se. They're extracting the active principle out of these plants and just studying that active principle. So the polypharmacology of, you know, a whole interaction of all the mechanisms of the substances is lost in that colonial thinking. Mm-hmm. And I think this leads to the other part of colonialism, which is this extractive approach of understanding these molecules leaves out all the cultural container of these substances. Mm-hmm. And we've worked hand by hand with indigenous peoples, and they've always, you know, they've had like this way of predicting what they call the small brother as the Western world, and all the mistakes that need to happen until we really remember who we are. And one of the things that indigenous peoples have warned us about what's going on with the psychedelic renaissance is that whenever substances or plant medicines that actually have a spirit travel abroad without the cultural container, there can be an imbalance in what they call the spiritual laws that are as important as the laws and the United Nations treaties, because we're talking about spiritual imbalances. And the best lawyers that I've ever met are indigenous, because they have, you know, the qualities and faculties to really balance cosmic imbalances. And so the Western world is really extracting from, you know, the completion of a system just the molecules that they want to put in a laboratory and then put it into a pill. But this is the memory of, you know, these people, the indigenous peoples. And so I guess if we keep on fostering, you know, science, of course this is something that we really desire. But the frustration, and I think here with my friends, they totally agree with this, the main problem is that policies are not being based on science. And for me, this is a transversal pivot that we really need to look at, because it doesn't matter if it's in the psychedelic field or climate change or whatever. None of the policies that are going on in the world are really based on science. And by science, I mean ancestral science as well, because these people know how to preserve nature and know how to preserve health, and they know how to preserve, and they've been preserving everything that we forgot, but now we're ready to remember. This is what the psychedelic renaissance is really about, in my view. It's about remembering a way of being in life. So this is what the other part of the, you know, colonial, new ways of colonialism are being manifested, even in the United Nations. And of course, under the United Nations Convention on Narcotic Drugs, there's only 3 plants considered illegal, right? Which is the coca leaf, hopefully we'll get to reschedule that, the opium poppy, and cannabis, which was rescheduled, but still it's on the Schedule 4. And in the psychotropic substances treaty, you have mescaline, you have psilocybin, you have DMT, you have MDMA, and you have LSD. But what is actually within the body of the text of this convention is that it is only for synthetic molecules. But again, the colonialist approach, the colonial thinking that has the mask of prohibitionism, really reduces all the pharmacology, all the richness of these plants into one molecule. And this is the problem that we're facing. So it's not the mushroom what is illegal, it's psilocybin what is illegal. But of course, in the colonial thinking, they reduce all the cultural richness of this into just one molecule. And for this situation, people are being arrested. And we have, you know, 3 cases where 3 persons are facing life sentences for the use of plants. And so this is on the rise. And I totally agree with what Kasia has been saying these days about how important it is that the psychedelic movement really supports the drug policy movement, the harm reduction movement. And also I want to honor the work that, you know, our elders in our tradition have been doing, you know, kind of advocating and paving the way so we can come here right now and really talk about these substances, but always in advice and in in complete respect of the indigenous peoples. So, muito obrigada por sua presença.
I mean, it also occurs to me that even framing the frame of policy and reform is imperfect for bringing in everything that you are saying needs to be part of not just laws but imaginations and understanding, and a point of reverence, which needs to be formalized. And it's interesting to me that you're coming at it through legal defense, but in that way, representing peoples and communities and traditions becomes a force, reshaping policy in a way that the traditional forces or other more obvious forces might not.
Yes, and I have a perfect example that really demonstrates why we need to think, you know, in a more prosper way. You know, I've been supporting the Tubu Hurimasan Nation, so they're based in Colombia, but they're displaced group, indigenous peoples. They were displaced from the Valley of Vaupés, and they were displaced by the FARC, the illegal armed forces. They burned fire into their maloca, their temple, and they were displaced into the outskirts of Bogota. But they brought with them all of their plant medicines that they use on a daily basis. So they brought their coca leaf, and they brought their yopo, and they brought their yahe, and they brought you know, other plant medicines that they use. But now they're in an urban context of Bogota. What happened later is that even preserving their plant medicines, they were manifesting a lot of sickness, illness, mental confusion, and so on. So what this demonstrates is that we cannot put the accent on the molecules or the substance per se, but it is actually the relationship with the territory what actually heals. And so if we continue to just extract the substance and put it in a lab, we're going to continue to do this extractive, you know, way of thinking, rather than really just understanding how these people heal. And it is through the direct relationship with the land, with the spirit of the land. And so this is why drug policy is not enough. Because we also need to look at sustainability, because the Western world is healing with ayahuasca, but that brings a lot of deforestation in the jungle. So we really need to think in, you know, in broader picture, and of course drug policy is, you know, very important pole of this global maloca that we're building, but it goes far beyond that. It's about biocultures.
Yeah. Allison.
I don't want to go after Natalia.
I mean, so you are an attorney, and you work at the intersection of law and psychedelics. Who are your clients?
Pretty much any time there is a supported psychedelic experience that I can decide is defensibly legal, I can work on it as a legal professional. Mm-hmm. And so my range is from ketamine-assisted psychotherapy practitioners to trip sitters, which I think are providing harm reduction services as long as they are not distributing the substance, to educators, training programs on integration or space holding, to the less clearly legal, more gray area, technically illegal but defensible religious exercise involving psychedelics in the United States.
Yeah, and the United States has its very own distinct and defining relationship with the notion of religious liberty. Right. And yet, interestingly, you've been involved in representing the now psychedelic communities and practices becoming churches, right? But they have global roots.
Some do.
Some do, yeah.
There are communities in the United States that have lineages that are very true, and they've been either moved from a place where it's practiced traditionally, or they apprenticed with someone for a sufficient period of time that I think it isn't appropriative, which is a real concern. But there are also what I've been calling emerging religions or religious practices, which are often not with traditionally used ceremonial substances, sometimes called sacraments. Pretty much everything that Ghoul identified this morning as different kinds of, empathogens or hallucinogens, you can call an entheogen, which is a substance used for a spiritual experience. And I will say that in the United States, people are using all of them in a container with a ritual that is very intentional and supported. And it is spiritual for them. And we can argue it is religion, protectable religion under the guaranteed right in the United States. And that's pretty unique.
Was this dynamic in the picture when you first started practicing law at this intersection?
It's why I started practicing law at this intersection, yes.
I mean, it's such an interesting development, isn't it?
Well, it started very early. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act passed in 1993. There were two major cases, one at the Supreme Court level, one was in 2006, that granted an exemption from the Controlled Substances Act, saying your use of ayahuasca is legal, this one church. So not every ayahuasca church, which is very important. And then another church in 2009 also received an exemption for ayahuasca.
Are these Brazilian rooted or?
So one was a Santo, well, the first was UDV, their lineage was UDV, and the second was Santo Daime. And so that helped the case because the lineage was established in Brazil. There's legal use of ayahuasca in Brazil under these churches. So I really think that helped. And to just be very clear, there's an incredibly complex balancing test between the right to religious exercise, where you have to prove that you're sincere, that it is religion, which I think in and of itself, the way we define religion is discriminatory and prejudiced and has stigma and prefers Judeo-Christian concepts. But if you can prove your religion and you can prove you're sincere, then the government says, we have these compelling interests, which are deeply rooted in the Controlled Substances Act, that there's a potential harm to participants, and we are worried about the substance being used for not religious purposes. So you have to show that you are minimizing those interests to a point that the right to religious exercise is overcoming those inherent risks they're concerned about. And then you get an exemption, maybe, But then this year, actually, another church based on Shipibo traditions actually settled with the DEA. And so that is now our third exemption, plus the exemption that just exists as a blanket exemption for the Native American church with peyote. But there is a petition process to apply for religious exemption. It does not function, I will just say, but the DEA did put it out in 2009. And I think there is some movement happening, which is really exciting, in that people are putting pressure on them, that it is dysfunctional and potentially, I would say very clearly, illegally implemented.
Okay, I'm sounding like Simeon. We have 6 minutes and so much to talk about. But I mean, this is such a fascinating, glimpse of the landscape. One question I want to ask all of you. I mean, I was curious for those of you who've been in this field a little bit longer, things that worked or didn't work along the way in the battles that have been won. What insights you might have for this emerging landscape, which has similarities and differences, but also for, let's just, in these last minutes, anything that occurs, but also, are there places in the world, are there regions, are there particular countries that are getting some of this right? The matter of access, the matter of an equity of access, the matter of respecting traditional lineages, of getting away from this punitive impulse.
Since I'm holding this, I'll just go ahead, which is to say, I think what's really, in addition to the religious freedom component in the United States, the fact that we have the states, which feel less beholden to these conventions that are global. The federal government is always going to keep its schedule, its controlled substances schedule, very similar to that articulated globally. But the states have bucked that. And so now in Oregon, you can consume psilocybin in a service center in a non-medical setting. It's still a center, but it's not medical per se. And then Colorado now has a whole system with any natural medicine except for peyote, that personal use is decriminalized, and then supported, facilitated use in service centers are coming up. And I really think there are medical components that are helpful for people because that context helps them. They are colonized. They are in this culture. They feel safer when supported by a medical screening and in a room with a therapist or a doctor, and I think that's fine, to each their own, and that's really important. But some states are looking to what does communal use look like, which kind of calls back to indigenous practices. And I think we have to look at that benefit. When the Santo Daime did get their exemption, one piece of evidence that they used was a study on the actual people in that community, and they showed they were healthier than the general population. That communal use, supported use, community itself was a health benefit in conjunction with this experience and this entheogenic experience, the ritual. So,
just go down and just have some final thoughts on either these questions I posed or whatever occurs to you that you want to say as a leave in the room as a final reflection.
So I will, in sort of my professional lifespan, I have been blown away by the effectiveness of the AIDS movement. And I think there are lessons learned in that community that are relevant to us in drug policy movement, and I don't think we have done enough of an analysis to draw those lessons out. Two examples. One of them is access to antiretroviral medicines. I think we can learn from it. To think about that, people were dying terrible, painful deaths end of 90s, and then beginning of 90s, and then by the end of 90s, beginning of 2000, medicines were available across the globe, not just for the global north, but for people in the global south. TRIPS agreements were broken. Countries stood up for their citizens. It was unbelievable. I mean, historically unbelievable. And Global Fund was created, right? UN Secretary General basically stepped out and said the institution that I lead is incompetent to take care of financial needs related to HIV, and created an entirely new system, which is Global Fund. I think those are two important lessons learned, because they really broke the molds of how countries think about international assistance. And I would say that we need to go back to those stories and understand advocacy around those things that would benefit us. Again, I would say look up rather than look down for solutions.
Right.
Just realizing how many, the majority of the audience here being from Iceland, I'm thinking back, I was here in your country about 9 or 10 years ago, and the Icelandic Civil Liberties Union, it started, I think, by a fellow named Peter Thorstensen. It started really focused on drug law reform and invited me to come in and speak on media and the university and meet with ministers and other things like that. And I followed, there's an element about drug policy which is also regional. And I look at Scandinavia. I mean, I look at, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Iceland. and what's happening in this region, and how there's an element of locality that makes a difference. And for so many years, Sweden was the dominant force. And people around the world see Sweden as so liberal, but in fact, when it came to drugs, they were like Singapore in Europe. I mean, a hyper-repressive policy, low levels of drug use, but if you use drugs, you were more likely to die. You had a remarkable anti-cannabis sentiment throughout Scandinavia that I think was sort of came about because of the old anti-alcohol sentiment that you had, as we had in America 100 years ago. And it was interesting to see it peel away, to see first Denmark begin to break out on harm reduction and embrace safe injection sites and a little bit of cannabis reform and this and that. And then Norway with both local activists and harm reduction activists, and then Thorvald Stoltenberg, the remarkable, Norwegian, minister leading a way there. The conference Nordic Reform, which some of you may know about or should know about, that takes place in Oslo. I highly recommend it. It's where I met Svala, who was on the program here yesterday. But now I see Iceland. I mean, 10 years ago I was here. You think a little country of 350,000 people then, you're all kind of a family. It's all this. And then you hear about the police going in with dogs to clubs where young people were dancing and partying. And you think, Iceland, you think it's so civilized, nice, but police with dogs, drug-sniffing young people for drugs. And yet you see Iceland is evolving in a way. Norway has evolved, right? I mean, even some murmurings in Finland. And so I think that global context, and so now I hold out hope that Iceland can become more of a leader on harm reduction more broadly in the Scandinavian region, and hopefully on psychedelics. Because if Iceland can emerge not just as a leader in the region, but even given your role in the EU and given the role in the United Nations as an independent nation, and where there's a high level of engagement and sophistication throughout the society, including at the higher reaches, I mean, it would be nice to see Iceland emerge as the global leader in this area.
The challenge has been laid down. Natalia, quick last word. Final thought?
I was just thinking of any state that really is doing it right, and I can only think about Peru really quickly because, of course, ayahuasca is considered a cultural heritage of the country, but what's most interesting is that they also elevated the Ícaro as cultural heritage. The Ícaro is the singing, is what is believed that actually heals, because the Ícaro is interpreted as the voice of the earth that is singing and singing and singing patiently for us to remember.
Tadeusz, you get the last word.
Yeah, so we are out of time since a few minutes, so I will just say I also thought about HIV because initially no one thought that you could treat people because, treatments would be too expensive and there is too much stigma, and I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.